We would not dispute the fact this morning that God is good. But what do you do when it looks like He's let you down? He hasn't let you down, but from your point of view, it looks like He has. Habakkuk had those kinds of questions. He starts out his book, if you recall from a few weeks ago, asking some questions. How long, O Lord, are we going to have to put up with this injustice, this unfairness? When are you going to do something about it, God? And God speaks to Habakkuk and He says, I am going to do something about it. In fact, it's going to be shock and awe. And Habakkuk is going, hey, this is great. God's finally going to answer my prayer. He's going to do what I've been wanting Him to do. And God says, hold on a minute. It's not going to be what you think it is. In fact, I'm going to use the wicked Babylonians to punish my people. And Habakkuk's going, what's up with this, God? So what do when God doesn't seem to make sense to you? And so then we get to chapter 2, which is where we're at today. And Habakkuk finally hears what God is going to do eventually with the Babylonians. This is what he says to the prophet, beginning in verse 4. So I wrote, look how pompous he is. Something is not right in his soul. He's not honest and just. But the righteous one will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays the proud man who is always restless. He has a big appetite. It is like the deep, dark pit of the dead. Like death, he is never justified. He's never satisfied. He gathers all the nations to himself and collects all the people for his own purposes. Woe to him who hoards what is not his. How long can he profit from extortion and debt? Woe to him who builds his house on such evil profits, who puts his nest up high, safe for the future, safe from disaster. Woe to him who builds a city on bloodshed, and who establishes a town by injustice. Woe to you who give his neighbors a drink, who keeps filling their cup with your anger and malice to intoxicate them, so you can uncover their shame and look at their nakedness. Woe to him who says to a block of wood, wake up, or to a silent stone, arise. Are inanimate objects your teachers? Look, it may be covered in gold and silver, but there's no breath of life inside. But the Eternal One, God, is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent in his presence. Heather Zenfel lives in Washington, D.C. And one day when she was walking home from work, she fell into a hole, a 7-foot sinkhole. There was no hole there. It didn't pre-exist before she walked onto the spot. As soon as she stepped foot on it, it broke open and she fell in. It literally swallowed her up. There she was in this hole near a very busy intersection. She says, I was certain somebody would come over right away. They'd run over and they'd help me out. But no one came. So she tried to call her husband Ryan, and it went to voicemail. No one saw, she says, no one heard, no one was coming. She was in a pit, not of her own making. She tried a lot of strategies and ways to get out before she finally realized she couldn't get out by herself. So she says, I stirred up all the humility and guts that I could to finally yell out for help. She said it began as a whisper from one who was self-assured and self-confident, and it evolved into the cry of one who was completely aware and vulnerable of her vulnerable and helpless situation. The cry escalated from discomfort to despair. The cry, though, was met with silence. No one seems to hear. No one responds. For how long? Just like Habakkuk, she was in a confusing situation that was not brought on by herself, and she was powerless to do anything about it. Again, Habakkuk starts off by saying, how long must I cry out, O God, and get no answer from you? Well, last time we talked about falling into what Seth Godin calls life's dips. You've been walking along with God on the mountaintop of life, and all of a sudden, without warning, you fall into this deep crevasse, one you cannot get out of by yourself. It is literally a wilderness experience for you. It's a time that challenges you and all that you believe, particularly what you believe about God. It tests your faith, and you cry out to Him, just like Heather did. And it seems like He didn't even see, He didn't hear, and He's not coming. God is silent. So what do the righteous, those who are committed to a right relationship with God and right living for God, what do the righteous do when God is not answering? What do the righteous do when they've fallen into a sinkhole? What do the righteous do when it seems like the world around them is just crumbling and falling apart? What do the righteous do when it seems like the wicked are prospering and doing just fine, but it's the godly who are suffering and tempted to fall into despair? Well, Habakkuk gets the answer to that question. We'll get into this a little bit more. But he says in verse 4, this is what God says, "But the righteous one will live by his faithfulness." In Habakkuk's case, God told him that he was going to use the even more wicked Babylonians to punish his own people for their wickedness. And Habakkuk wonders, why would you do that, God? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem right. In fact, if I could say this, God, it doesn't seem godly. Can we sing, "Great is thy faithfulness," when it seems like God is not being faithful to us? Larry Crabb says, "A happy child's life works well until it's tested." When your faith in God is tested, what will it reveal? God wants to know if we're going to be faithful to Him no matter what happens to us. Will we have the kind of faith that Corrie ten Boom had, which he said, "However deep the pit, God's love is deeper still." So finally, God shows Habakkuk that the Babylonians are going to get theirs. Even though God uses the evil of the Babylonians to get the Israelites' attention, He says, "I do not approve of the Babylonian tactics." God is going to destroy them. And so verse 4 says, "Look at the proud. They trust in themselves, and their lives are crooked." The Hebrew is, they're all puffed up. Their pride serves their interests, and in their minds, their strength. What the Babylonians have been able to do, that's their real God. Puffed up can also mean a loss of faith. When your circumstances cause you to lose faith in God, you can be just as full of pride and putting trust in your own strength as you are the Babylonians. If I were God, I would do this differently than what you're doing, God. Why aren't you answering? And so in your puffed up state of mind, it shows that you've lost faith in God. You're putting too much trust in your own strength and strategies. No wonder, if we're not careful, we will fall into despair. And so God turns to issue a series of woes to show why the Babylonians are ultimately going to be destroyed themselves. Now, a woe is a statement of judgment, of doom. God's condemnation is about to fall because of your actions. It's like saying, Oh no, it's like what you would do when your mom would call out and use your full name. You knew you were in trouble. You're in deep weeds. It's what Isaiah experienced when, in the presence of God, he said, "Woe is me," I cried. "I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Isaiah says, "I'm ruined. When I remember whose presence I'm in, then I'm humbled, not haughty or puffed up. I'm repentant, not rebellious." So don't live like a Babylonian when things are crumbling around you. You see, Babylon in biblical imagery refers to a person who's making a name for himself in defiance of God. And that's what the Babylonians were doing. And so he says, look how pompous he is. Something is not right in his soul. Babylon wages war against God by seducing people away from God, intent on destroying the children of God. And so these 5 woes that we find here in chapter 2 are really a double warning. They're first of all a warning to the wicked, and then secondly, a warning to the righteous of how not to live. This is what God's going to say. Don't live like the world around you when your personal world is falling apart. When God seems to be absent and you're confused about what He's doing, those who live by faith keep on choosing righteousness, not wickedness. What you believe and how you live, they're linked together. If you're still putting your faith in God, then no matter what's going on around you, you live faithfully. Like Job, you say, "Though He slay me, yet I will trust in Him. I will hope in Him. It may look hopeless, but my hope is in God." So how should we live when the situation looks hopeless and God doesn't seem to be anywhere? The answer is, not like a Babylonian. Not like somebody who doesn't know God, but like somebody who's continuing to put their hope and trust in Him. And so Habakkuk hears about 5 warnings. We're going to narrow it down into 3. They can be put into 3. These 3 things are what we tend to do if we don't put our trust in God. These are ways of the world seducing us away from God to try and live like everybody else. This is what we see the Babylonians do. And one of these seductions, the first one, is the seduction of greed. The first 2 woes are about extortion and unjust gain. Notice what he says in verses 9 and 10. "Woe to him who hoards what is not his. How long can he profit from extortion and debt? Woe to him who built his house on such evil profits, who puts his nest up high, safe from the future, safe from disaster." You see, the Babylonians, they were going around and destroying the nations around them. They lusted for more than what they had. And so when God seems to be giving you less than you think you deserve, you can follow the world's way. The world's scheme of taking what is not yours for yourself. Because after all, God's not giving you what you think you should have. You justify your greed. You're entitled to it. God should have given it to you. You're going to have it one way or another, even if it's at somebody else's expense. You see, the 10th commandment was all about something called covetousness. It's not a word that we go around using all the time. But Exodus 20:17 explains what it is. It says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or maidservant, or his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Coveting is lusting after something that doesn't belong to you. Something that if you take it for yourself, it will destroy you and it will destroy other people. When we look at life as something to seize for ourselves, or people as somebody to be manipulated for our ends, then we have been seduced. by the Babylonians. The more we give into this seduction, the more it controls us. It will ultimately destroy us. The third woe is specific about how people are being victimized. In verse 12 it says, "Woe to him who builds a city on bloodshed and who establishes a town by injustice." You see, there is no getting ahead in this life, true getting ahead at other people's expense. Taking advantage of people, harming people, ruining people's lives over the lust of your wants. That's not what God wants. Ephesians 4:28 says there are three ways to gain something in life. One of them is to steal it. That's the Babylonian way. The second way is to work for it. And the third is to receive it as a gift. Trying to get ahead at other people's expense is the way of wickedness. In fact, it is the ultimate form of wickedness. Because the Ten Commandments, all of them, are rooted in covetousness, desiring for myself what God doesn't intend for me to have. When I steal what is not mine, I go against honesty, integrity, godliness, faithfulness. And so even Jesus says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of one's possessions. What you possess for yourself. That's not what life is all about. Sometimes people will say, well, you know, when wickedness is happening around us, where is the judgment of God? I don't see God doing anything about it. But when we cave into these seductions, and when we live like the Babylonians, your life begins to bear the fruit of how you live. You see, the judgment of what's going on around us is what you see happening in people's lives. Living in despair, living without God. We begin to see how that works out in people's lives. Greed will destroy you. Only God can sustain you. There's a second seduction we must beware of, and that's a seduction of uncontrolled appetites. Notice what it says in verse 15. God says, "Woe to you who gives his neighbors a drink, who keeps filling their cup with your anger and malice to intoxicate them, so that you can uncover their shame and look at their nakedness." When we're seduced by our appetites, they will eventually destroy us. The Babylonians' desire for more led them to humiliating the people around them by getting them drunk and then stripping them naked. When you give your appetites control over your life instead of God, they will eventually humiliate you, shame you, expose you, and your God of appetite to public ridicule. Other prophets warn of the devastating effects of out-of-control appetites. Hosea says in Hosea 4:11, "Alcohol and prostitution have robbed my people of their brains." What I find interesting about that is Scripture, God knows how we work, even before this was proven scientifically. Neuroscientists will tell you today that what may start out as a moral issue, alcohol, getting drunk, or prostitution, or what have you, you can throw whatever you want in there. It starts out as a moral issue, but eventually it becomes a brain issue, because your blood chemistry has changed. And so what you thought you could start out controlling, eventually it takes control over your life, and it will destroy you. Your passions are not meant to be negative things. God gives us our passions. Our passions should be driving you to God, to trust God, to serve God, no matter what you're facing, or regardless of whether you understand it all or not. But when your passions drive you into self-destructive behaviors, you're giving into an out-of-control life, rather than entrusting yourself to the control and goodness of God. And that out-of-control life then becomes God's judgment upon your life, because you can no longer control it. You're substituting what God says is good with your own form of goodness. Only your form of goodness will destroy you. and not sustain you. And so the world's idea of feeling good when it seems to be looking bad is to pleasure yourself in ways that ultimately will ruin you, control you, eventually humiliate you and shame you, and ultimately destroy you. Paul said, rather than getting drunk with wine, we should be filled with the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control or self-restraint. He says, since this is the kind of life we have chosen, the life of the Spirit, let us make sure that we just don't hold on to it as an idea or some sentiment in our hearts, but let's work out its implications in every area of our lives. Good times, bad times, times when we don't understand what's going on, times that we have no idea where God is and what He's up to. Unless our passion is the will of God and we live for His glory, and our craving is to be controlled by the fruit of the Spirit, we will be upended by uncontrolled appetites. There's another way that we're in danger of being seduced when God doesn't seem to be doing what we think He should do. And that's the seduction of false gods. Verse 19, woe to him who says to a block of wood, wake up, or to a silent stone, arise. Are inanimate objects your teachers? Look, it may be covered in gold and silver, but there's no breath of life inside. Now, archaeologists, as they have done some excavating in Babylon, they've discovered about 50 temples there. The Babylonians worship a lot of false gods. They worship whatever they believed would get them whatever they wanted. An idol is anything that takes God's rightful place in our lives. An idol is something that we're putting our hope in, that this is going to finally give me what I want. John Calvin said, the human heart is an idol factory. It's all the time producing an idol. We manufacture all kinds of false gods to satisfy us when God doesn't seem to be responding in the way that we want. Now, your idols are probably not stone or wood. This afternoon, probably one of them is a big screen, and it's either the Rams or the Patriots. I don't know. Your idol might even be a false belief you have about God. My God would never do, and you fill in the blank, but He's doing exactly what you thought He wouldn't do. And so what that reveals is an idol. When you're upset because God is not acting the way you think God should, you're serving some kind of false God. You're focused more on what He's supposed to give you than knowing Him as He is. You're focused on what you want instead of what He wants of you. Some questions that might help you to see where there could be false gods in your life could be these. What do I believe God is supposed to do for me? And what do I think of Him when He's not? Or where or what do I turn to cope with life when life is not going my way? Or where do I focus my attention when I don't seem to have God's attention? How faithful are you to the God that you claim to worship? How much of your focus and affection is centered on Jesus Christ? Is He truly the lover of your soul? Are you maybe 50% devoted to Him? Perhaps 75%. I give 3/4 of myself to Him. Or even 95%. But if we said a person was only 95% devoted to their spouse, would we consider that person to be faithful or unfaithful? 5% unfaithfulness means you're unfaithful. You can't play around with loving God and following Christ. Either God is God and He's your focus and attention, or He's not. If the Bible teaches us anything about how the Israelites related to God, God's people were rarely completely abandoning the one true God. I mean, they would serve God, but they would also serve all these other things alongside him. They just wanted to make sure that by serving God and all these other little idols along the way, that all the bases were covered. If God wasn't going to take care of this, then maybe this God over here would. We could be in danger of doing the exact same thing. For example, we like to think of our life in terms of priorities. We make this list of our priorities, and we put Jesus on the very top. But you know, God doesn't want to be on the top of an ever-shifting list of priorities. Because maybe sometimes I'll put something else up there instead of him. He wants to be intimately involved with every priority in your life. He doesn't want to be first, he wants to be central in everything that you do. You end up serving a false god anytime you think of God as something less than he is. Or you give your devotion to something else that you think will give you what you want. And whatever that is, it will turn you into a slave of false beliefs and destructive ways of living. And those destructiveness, that will be God's judgment on you turning away from him. God will do whatever he must to rip those idols out of our hearts so that he has our allegiance and trust. And so some of that might be what we end up experiencing. So what's to be different then about how the righteous live? When life is confusing and God doesn't make sense, what do the righteous do instead? Well, here's what they don't do. They don't go around puffed up about what they can do in their own strength. And they don't give in to the seductions of the Babylonians, the strategies of a heart that's choosing to live in defiance of God. What do the righteous do? Verse 4 again. But the righteous one will live by his faithfulness. What do the righteous do when everything else seems to be going wrong? The righteous live by faith. The bottom line is, upside down, unfair parts of life, they're eventually going to get righted. The wicked will get their comeuppance. And so why can we live by faith? Because of three little words. But the Lord. You need to remember these three words if you're going to endure with faith. Verse 20, but the Lord, the Eternal One, is in his holy temple. Let the earth keep silent in his presence. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. God is still on the throne. He's still in charge, no matter what your circumstances tell you, no matter what you're going through. Never let go of this truth. But the Lord. Habakkuk didn't get the answer he wanted from God, but he still believed in God. He reminds me of three other men who faced a terrible choice. And if Karen was up here, she would tell you the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know if you remember those guys. Their future was serving as fuel in a fiery furnace, unless they bowed down to another Babylonian god, this one called King Nebuchadnezzar. But here's what they said to King Neb. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. These men boldly stood up to the king, and they said, we believe our God can. We believe our God will. But even if he doesn't, we still believe. But the Lord, everything we need to believe and trust in is found in that statement. Our God is able, but even if he chooses not to, we're still going to put our hope in him. Why? Because even though we might be upset, we might be confused or frustrated or disappointed or impatient, I will remember who God is. And what do I know about him? Well, this is the short list. The Lord is still in charge. The Lord is good. We sang about that just a few moments ago. The Lord is righteous. He does the right thing. The Lord is true. The Lord is faithful. The Lord is all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-present. The world may seem to be upside down, but the Lord is still here. The Lord is sovereign, and He has a plan, a much bigger plan than I can see right now. I must respect that the Lord is God, and I am not. The Lord's timing is not my timing. The Lord's ways are higher than I can understand. The Lord is supreme in wisdom. He knows the end from the beginning. I'm a person created in His image, and He will never abandon me. And then as Habakkuk says at the end of our reading for today, the Lord still reigns from His holy temple. You see, God is never more near to us than when He seems to be most distant from us. It may not seem like He's around, but He's going through the fire with us. We choose to be faithful to Him because we know He's going to be faithful to us. And when we look around and assume God is nowhere to be found, we need to look and see He's still on the throne. When you leave God on the throne, there's only one way to respond. It's how Habakkuk was told to respond. Verse 20, let all the earth keep silent in His presence. Now the Hebrew word for silence is pronounced hush. John records another great hush that is coming. Revelation 8:1, he said, a great silence filled heaven, penetrating everything for about a half hour. You see, when we find that we've run out of words to complain, to question, to plead, then silence evokes the greatest answer. When God speaks, there's nothing left for us to do but to trust Him and worship Him. When the world around you is crumbling and you're struggling, the most important issue is, where do you stand with God? Are you ready to say, Jesus is enough, no matter what's happening? Jesus, I believe you are the Savior of the world. Jesus, I believe you're the Lord of my life. And Jesus, I put my complete trust in you. That's what the righteous do. Would you stand with me as we pray? God, may we not forget that you have not forgotten us, that you are on the throne. And Lord, you are with us, even now, no matter what we face. Give us the faith to continue to put our trust in you and to do as you would have us do. We ask this in Jesus' name.